This is Talk Business and Politics with Roby Brock.
And welcome to the program. I'm Roby Brock. We appreciate you tuning in with us. I am joined now by Janine Parry. She is with the University of Arkansas, professor of political science, and she is the leader of the Arkansas poll, which came out just a few days ago. And we are always glad to have her with us. Janine, thank you so much for being here.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Let's begin with some of the top lines on your poll, the things that everybody kind of talks about automatically, and that is popularity of elected officials. Governor Asa Hutchinson with a 62% approval rating. You've got Tom Cotton and John Boozman at 48 and 39% respectively. Tell me why you think Governor Hutchinson's more popular than John Boozman or Tom Cotton.
Well, that's just a pattern we've seen for decades nationwide. States tend to approve of their governors more than they approve of people in the Beltway. Surprise. It's just been something consistently that we've seen for almost 20 years on the Arkansas poll. And when you look at the available state polls that do occur over time, you see some similar patterns. It's just a lot harder to be working in the Beltway. In terms of popularity to be affiliated, I think with that environment, it has been the case for a very long time. In some ways, I always think that, I don't know what the equivalent quite is at the state level, but it's almost like we're super patriots at the state level. A sociologist would say we're just more closely connected to those individuals. And so it just tends to be the case that governors are typically 15, 20 points ahead of the Senate folks. The exceptions, of course, would be when Huckabee was facing the consolidation or participating in the school consolidation battles early on in our poll's history. He certainly took a dip there, but Arkansas governors, Democrats and Republicans tend to be well above the 50% mark and typically 60 to 75%. We see that again this year.
Why would anybody want to go to Washington, D.C. when you can be a popular governor back in the state? Anything interesting in the crosstabs there, just when you kind of drill down into the deeper numbers, do you see some things for Governor Hutchinson that bode well for him?
He, like Arkansas governors past, he does well across independents and then, of course, within his own party identifiers among Republicans. He doesn't do terribly among Democrats, and of course, that's kind of how you'd expect it to sort out, given how robust that approval rating is. You know, and I should say, too, it's not just that we know governors. I should also, of course, give a nod to he's got record low unemployment levels, and as your viewers in particular will know, that's been true for quite some time, right, and lower than the national average. We're seeing an uptick in average income in Arkansas, and in a state that's been poor for a long time. You know, this suggests that the state's headed in the right direction. Together, of course, with our questions in that regard. We always ask right direction, wrong direction questions, and how people are feeling financially, and those stay fairly steady, but this year there was a little uptick in those too. So in general, people may feel negatively about most of the news they're consuming at the national level and what's happening there, but they feel pretty good about what's happening in Arkansas.
Let's stay with the economy here, because that has always been the top issue that people identify as the most important issue or problem facing Arkansas. Economy tends to win out when you look at the history of the Arkansas poll. But you had a new entry this year because of the open-ended question that you asked on this, and it was drugs. I think it came in at about 8%. Tell me why you think that resonated. Do you think it's because of the opioid crisis that we're seeing more about and affecting more people? Is it medical marijuana, or do you think it's something else?
I can't know for sure, but I think your first hypothesis is likely right. If you think about when we were in the field, it was just before the president declared the national emergency, the national crisis in opioid use, addiction, overdose. So it was very much on the national agenda, so on the public agenda. In addition to that, though, because it was just before, and because, as you mentioned, in odd-numbered years, we ask the question open-ended and just do the best we can to record what people say. We don't want to predetermine what they think the most pressing issue or problem in Arkansas is today. And so there's a piece of me that wonders, for it to emerge organically this year in the way that it did and to the level it did, if people aren't actually just seeing the effects in their own communities. So it was interesting. You know, it's only 8%, but close to 1 in 10 Arkansans just identifying that out of the gate. You know, without being prompted as a significant problem. I thought that was a really telling sign of the larger thing that we've all been talking about.
Let's turn to two issues that you ask about very consistently, and we see very consistent results on these. This is the issue of abortion and whether or not it should become more or less restrictive, as well as gun control, which has certainly been on the forefront of a lot of conversations nationally and in the state. Why do you, we see just very consistent attitudes in the Arkansas poll over the 19-year history of this survey. Why do you think those two issues don't change so much when nationally we have seen quite a bit of movement on those issues?
Yeah, it's interesting. We've asked them the same way every time. And so in some ways, right, that's a telling indicator that people have a fairly consistent attitude that in general they'd like to see stricter abortion laws, but it's not generally a majority who would like to see so. And sometimes you'll see the gun restrictions step up a little bit, that people would like to see stricter regulation of guns, but it doesn't bounce around by more than a few points in a typical year. Sometimes it will also bounce down, maybe depending on what's on the national agenda. But in general, I think what we would say in political science, or just people who do public opinion in general, is that these are issues that are core issues. They go to strongly held beliefs and value systems. They're symbolic about people's general orientation toward policy and politics, and therefore they're pretty stable. They're pretty hard to move, as we've seen in the national conversation. Everybody sort of starts at a place and doesn't really move on the basis of events or new facts or what the other team may think is a persuasive argument. But instead we see just a strong consistency on the responses to these questions.
Last question for you, and this is on the topic of political affiliation. You always ask folks, do they identify as Republican or Democrat, independent, or maybe other or don't know. Independents are what surprised me. I went back and looked at all of the 19 years of asking that question. In the year 2000, 35% of Arkansans said they identified as independent voters. This past year, 35% said they identified as independent voters. What are you seeing in terms of mood swings of voters and their political affiliation?
Right, and then the connection to election outcomes, at least in even-numbered years. I know this is probably the question I look to first every year now for almost 20 years. And what we saw for the first 10 or so was, as you know, Democrats were typically 25 or 30 to 35% of the general population. Independents were 35 to 40% of the general population. And of course, we'd seen that for decades even before the Arkansas poll. And Republicans were only about a quarter. We've seen a slow uptick in Republican identification, a slow downtrend in Democratic identification, but still the independents are the ones who have the stronghold in the state and of course make or break statewide elections. What's been fascinating, though, is that independents, while for our first 10 years, they broke fairly evenly, Republican, Democrat, Independent, when we pressed them a little bit, with that second-tier question. You can tell me which way do you lean. In 2009, 2010, they took a strong rightward turn. We saw that for several years afterward, and of course that played out in election outcomes as we saw everything flip from Democrat to Republican over the course of just 3 election cycles. But this year, oddly and interestingly, the Democrats ticked up a little bit. Those Democratic-leaning independents was outside the margin of error. The Republicans stayed about where they were, and I just thought that was absolutely fascinating. I think if the Democrats in the state might see that in a softness, maybe an opening for them. I'm not sure they should read it that way. I don't expect Arkansas election outcomes to change anytime soon, but I did think it was fascinating given that the independents clearly have been buying the product that Republicans have been putting out up and down the ticket and across the board. So I have questions, I guess, that I'd like to see again next year into 2018 and then past that about what continues to happen with those independents. Maybe this year was just an outlier, or maybe there's something different still afoot in the Arkansas electorate, which is has a history for being surprising.
All right, she's Dr. Janine Parry with the University of Arkansas, and this has been the Arkansas Poll. Thank you so much, Janine. Appreciate you.
Thanks for having me.
All right. We're going to be back with more right after this word from our sponsors. We're going to talk politics with Rex Nelson and Shane Broadway.